Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, our guest is Wayne Winegarden, PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics and author of PRI's new study, Breaking Down Barriers, How Occupational Licensing Reform Can Improve the Insurance Markets, Benefit Consumers, and Expand Job Opportunities. We produced this study in the wake of record natural disasters in 2017. How is occupational licensing related to hurricanes and wildfires, you might ask? In the way it's affecting the victims of natural disasters. The issue is that those suffering from natural disasters are not quickly getting the funds they need to rebuild because of a shortage of insurance claim professionals. Indeed, the expense and red tape of obtaining occupational licenses cuts across many industries and professions. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, discusses with Wayne the problems of the current occupational licensing system and ways we can reform it. Thanks for listening.
Wayne, welcome back to PRI's podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me again.
So, in 2017, hurricanes such as Harvey and Maria and Irma and other weather events caused a record $300 billion in damages. Here in California alone, the devastating wildfires in Napa and in Santa Barbara and Southern California caused $18 billion in losses. And yet many families and businesses continue to face long rebuilding delays due to the shortage of claims professionals across the country. And this is the subject of your new brief, Breaking Down Barriers. Could you briefly explain why we have these shortages?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually a perfect case study for an Econ 101 class where you have just classic kind of shortages of supply, which is then going to impact pricing and in this case creates long delays. And the hurricanes and the wildfires, it actually accentuates a problem that's always there. So you have effectively a national insurance market, but you have state-level regulations that create kind of blockages of skilled people to get from kind of the state that they're in to the state where they're needed. So these professionals are called insurance claims adjusters. And so they'll have a license in about 34 states. You have to get a license in order to be an insurance adjuster. But states don't necessarily honor each other's licenses. So if you don't have a license to operate in another state, you can't come and help. So in California, when we have all the wildfires here, if you're licensed to practice in Nevada, but you don't have a license in California, you can't come and help someone who maybe has a claim, needs an insurance adjuster to come into the state to adjudicate that claim, and they can't cross the state line. They can't come and help. It creates an artificial shortage.
So certainly victims of natural disasters suffer particularly under the current system. It's like when a huge blizzard hits, everybody wants to go out and buy snow shovels, but there aren't enough to go around. We see that every year with the big blizzard in the Sierra here. In much the same way, disaster victims have to wait in line for claims adjusters, and the cost of these services go way up. So how would you say that we reform the current laws so that the market works and victims are better served?
I think the most important thing, if we step back for a second and talk about occupational licensing regulations, and that's kind of the broader issue here, that you have to get a license or permission from the state to kind of practice your profession. Now, at one point, only about 1 in 20 jobs needed state permission to do your job. Now it's about 1 in 4. So you've had this huge increase in basically having to get permission from the government in order to kind of do your job. So the very first thing we need to do, kind of looking at occupational licensing regulations, broadly speaking, is we need to start getting rid of these occupational licensing requirements for where they're just not needed for safety and these other considerations. I think the perfect example is interior designers, who actually have a very kind of rigorous kind of regulations that they have to follow. And quite frankly, if your interior designer gives you the wrong wallpaper, the world is not going to end. So whether that's kind of necessary to have a license, I think is quite questionable. When you start getting to professions where licenses could be justified, we need to have a system where you allow, once you're licensed in one state, you can practice, meeting certain kind of national requirements across the states, or what they call reciprocity. And that means you will end up with a much more flexible supply, in this case of insurance adjusters, to kind of deal with surges in demand or just general growth in demand more efficiently. Or take, for example, imagine a military family where one spouse is in the military, the other has a profession that's licensed. Military families just are notoriously have to move around a lot. Without reciprocity, the trailing spouse is going to have a much harder time working every time the family moves and goes to a new state. So reciprocity will have the benefit of helping families who move around to kind of have the ability to kind of keep practicing their professions.
Can you talk about what an average insurance adjuster has to do in order to obtain a license and what they also have to go through to serve someone in another state?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes the largest burden isn't the cost of a license, which in general, the average license is about $260 some odd. The average insurance adjuster, by the way, holds about 10 licenses. So they're spending about $2,700 or on their behalf. The company is spending that to get licenses in all the different states. And when you take that across all the license holders, you're talking about $330 million. That's just duplicative administrative costs, which in itself is quite silly. But then what can even be more problematic are all of the kind of education requirements and testing. And these take a lot of time, but it also becomes a barrier to people who have this profession.
As a supply-sider, you also discuss the supply side of the equation, which is the shortage of adjusters. It's been estimated that an average insurance adjuster holds 10 to 12 licenses, in which, as you say, most of which are redundant and be at a huge cost, as you know, costing hundreds of dollars. You know, this really has to be a big barrier if someone wants to pursue the profession in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking a lot about how if you're the victim of kind of a natural disaster, how not having an insurance adjuster on the demand side makes, you're waiting longer, your house isn't getting fixed, further damage can be occurring because of the delay. I mean, there's all sorts of expenses and inconveniences that are arising. On the supply side, the greater the barriers are for kind of individuals trying to kind of pursue these careers, the fewer people are going to be avail themselves of those opportunities. And it's typically those who are kind of in the worst financial positions that are hurt the most. So you're creating a barrier against people moving into the middle class. The more difficult you make it for people to get a job, and obviously that makes sense. If people, the higher the cost of anything, the less of it there will be.
I think you could view occupational licensing regulations as another of those well-intended government regulations. They were designed to protect consumers over the years so that they can be certain that a service provider that they call is qualified for the job. But we know that over the years, the requirements to obtain license have been piled on, and it really has driven up costs for consumers. Sally Pipes, who, as our listeners know, is PRI's president and CEO, tells the story that when she once wanted to buy upholstery for her furniture, she was only able to purchase the fabric she wanted through a licensed interior designer, as you mentioned earlier, and she didn't want to pay for the middleman. So when she went on a trip to London, she bought the fabric herself and had it shipped to the U.S., and it was far less expensive. So wouldn't really the regulatory burden that comes with so many occupational licenses have an overall dampening effect on the growth of some industries like interior design? Just in this case alone, a U.S. company lost Sally's business.
That's a great anecdote. Absolutely. And that exemplifies so many different aspects of the problem, right? If it's cheaper for you to buy product in London and ship it back all the way to California, that shows you that there really is something amiss, and that most importantly, this idea that this state-sanctioned quality is actually adding value exemplifies how it's not. It's not a signaling device, but really has become kind of a protection for those who currently have kind of the licenses against potential competitors. And often that's kind of what happens. You see the regulations become captured by the people who are supposed to be regulated by it. And instead of it being kind of this quality assurance signal, it becomes just a way to kind of guarantee a government sanctioned monopoly, or really what we would call an oligopoly. Very problematic, very costly for the economy, and something kind of rife for reform.
Staying on that theme, many people who run small businesses, and we're talking the interior decorators we've mentioned, hairstylists, electricians, plumbers, real estate agents, they all need licenses. And we have seen in recent years a decline in small business job growth. And we know that small business is key to the economy. I think it's something like 99% of all the businesses in California are small businesses. Thinking of that, do you think that occupational licensing's requirements have had something to do with this decline in small business job growth?
Absolutely. If you actually look at, and this is actually in the paper that we've just published, if you look at growth in the regulations, and if you look at growth in the number of jobs that new startup businesses are able to create, they're moving in opposite directions, where you see an increase in the regulatory burden, and at the same time you're seeing a kind of significant decrease in the number of jobs that startup businesses are creating. And that's the lifeblood, right? That's the startup businesses are the entrepreneurs sitting in the garages saying, hey, I can change the world. The more regulatory burdens we put on them so that it's harder for them to get out of their garage and create a real job, or all of the different requirements. And it goes beyond just these occupational licensing, which is an important part of it. The slower our economy is going to grow, the less kind of innovations, the less kind of quality of life improvements we're going to get. And so this is very disconcerting. It's a very clear trend. And it's also a trend that's evident. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is kind of an association that represents small businesses, and they do surveys of their members. And inevitably, one of the top issues that small businesses always complain about is the high cost of regulations. They're just not able to kind of devote the resources to comply with it. And it dips into too much of their income and then makes the entrepreneurial kind of risk not worth it. So occupational licensing regulations are an important part of that. It's something we need to address. And the sooner we address it, the more vibrant our economy can become.
Wayne, in your study, I thought you had a really interesting comparison tracking the growth and the number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations and comparing it to the number of job gains through startup businesses. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of puts into detail what I was just talking about, that if we look at kind of a 5-year period, the reason to look at 5-year periods is because in any specific year, you're going to have all sorts of volatility. So to kind of smooth that around, and you can see that during the late 1990s, which was a very prosperous time, the number of pages, which is a kind of a proxy for how burdensome regulations are, they were declining, which is an indication that there was deregulation going on and that the number of kind of mandates that businesses had to comply with were going down. Well, we had over 1.2 million jobs created in new startup businesses alone in each and every year. Since that time, we've seen growth over every 5-year period in terms of the number of pages in the Federal Register, and the amount of job gains consistently has declined. And that's both during the Great Recession and after the Great Recession and before the Great Recession. And so now we're down to about 800,000. And it's like I said, it's a very visible trend that as the number of regulations or the burden from regulations have increased, the amount of jobs that entrepreneurial ventures are creating are going down.
So finally, Wayne, as we wrap this up, what do you see are the prospects for reform in Washington and in the state? Are there models that we can learn from?
There are. I mean, we should mention, when we talk about the insurance adjusters, that the 34 states have these regulations, which of course means 16 don't. So, that's important to note in and of itself in terms of something to learn about. But this whole idea of reciprocity, and there's movement, there's a thing called the Claim Act, which is talking about trying to create a kind of format so that if states' regulations are compliant with it, that you can then have reciprocity across the states, which means if I have an occupational license in California, that I can then go practice in Nevada, I can practice in Oregon, I can go to Arizona, or go to Florida, and you'll have a more efficient kind of day-to-day processing of claims. And if there's a growing demand in a certain area because there's more economic growth, then you're going to be able to get more insurance adjusters to deal with those issues. But if you have a hurricane that hits Texas and then it hits Florida, and so now you have severe shortages in both regions because you can't get people across the country because we had this kind of 1-2 punch of these hurricanes. Reciprocity would allow the market to be more efficient. It would allow insurance adjusters from across the country to be able to help households and families and businesses put their lives back together after these types of disasters. And that would be very meaningful and very important.
So, Wayne, if our listeners are interested in reading a copy of your new study, Breaking Down Barriers, how can they do so?
Go visit pacificresearch.org and download a copy. I highly encourage it.
And there's also, while you're at pacificresearch.org, there's a great little animated video that we also just released that shows in pretty easy to understand terms the problems with this licensing issue and how reform could help disaster victims and all customers alike.
And with a fantastic narrator.
Yes, I like the narrator myself. Well, Wayne, thank you very much for joining us again for PRI's podcast.
Oh, thank you. Have a great one.
Thanks again to our guests, Wayne Winegarden and Tim Anaya. To download the study, Breaking Down Barriers, go to PRI's website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our blog, Right by the Bay, on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.